I'm Lawrence Carrel, Secretary and Board Member of the New York Financial Writers Association, which is the nation's oldest organization devoted to business and financial journalism. And we hold monthly education events both in person and online. I'm a contributor to Forbes and Barron's and the author of ETS for the Long Run, Dividend Stocks for Dummies, and Investing in Dividends for Dummies. Tonight, I'll be hosting a panel on reporting the financial fallout of the Ukraine war. We have Patricia Cohen, the London-based global economics correspondent for the New York Times, Howard Schneider, a Federal Reserve reporter in Washington for Thomson Reuters, and also in Washington, Ian Talley, who writes about sanctions, terror finance, and illicit financial networks for the Wall Street Journal. We are hoping that Stephanie Baker, senior writer for Bloomberg, will join us soon. Okay, so are you guys all still working from home?
Yes.
Indeed, yes, so far.
I go into the office now and again.
Okay, so what do you think is the hardest thing about covering this conflict? I'll just go through each one of you. Howard, what do you think is the hardest thing about covering this conflict?
Well, okay, so to me, this is the hardest thing about it is it has, I think, opened the door on and made more credible the probability that coming out of the pandemic, this world is going to look even more different than we thought it was before. That you've added to probably some structural shifts in globalization, some structural shifts in commodity pricing and other pricing dynamics. That everybody's, I think, we're going to spend the next 5 to 10 years just getting a grip on. So whatever we thought we understood in the sort of short to medium term about the post-pandemic economy, I think is now going to become a longer term sort of process of understanding. And I think this is going to be true for the central banks as well as the economists and the analysts.
Well,
okay, let me take 1 second. I have Stephanie trying to get in. Britt, do you want to write to Stephanie and send her a link to get into the thing?
I just resent it to her again.
Okay, so Patty, what do you think is the hardest thing about covering this conflict? And in the fog of war, where do you go for reliable information?
Right. So, well, I agree with everything Howard said, but I guess in this situation, which is not unlike, I guess, other crises that or unexpected events that happen, whether like the pandemic, it's suddenly there are all of these, whether it's institutions, practices, policies that you have never heard of before, or I have never heard of before, I had no idea about, and that you suddenly have to become expert on. So I'll just give one example, like the SWIFT system, which maybe you guys knew about, but I didn't. Suddenly it was, I don't know, it reminded me of kind of like that, the 2000 election where everyone was talking about hanging Chad suddenly, and nobody knew what that was before, and that it was suddenly a big thing. And so it's, it's kind of a crash course that you have to take instantly in all these things. What does it mean when a central bank suddenly finds some of its assets frozen? I mean, we haven't had even experienced that much with these things. So, you're calling around to experts, but it's all a bit speculative, and you're doing it under deadline and such. And so there's a lot of, and of course, you want to get it right the first time. so that's a lot of pressure sometimes.
And Ian, what do you think is the hardest thing about covering this conflict, and where do you go for reliable information?
Well, first, let me say, as a troglodyte in my basement from DC, I really have to give a shout out to the reporters on the ground in Russia and in Ukraine. I really can't talk about the difficulties of my reporting when the folks on the ground are facing physical risks, the risks of media messaging by Russia and the government, etc. So with that caveat or that context, I think the most difficult is transparency of data. I think you could rate countries, their growth prospects and their institutions' strength by the transparency of their data. And when you talk about Russia, you're not talking about an extremely transparent, data transparent place. So there's difficulty there. You know, the central bank has some English data on their site. They have a lot more in Cyrillic, and I'm not a Russian reader. We do have them, but you know, everybody's all hands on deck. And then there's the flows of money. We want to understand what they are. You know, the data is delayed if we get it from you know, the BIS and others. And then you have, you know, what's actually happening on the ground. You know, anecdotally, we can see, you know, bank runs, but what's happening in the boardrooms? What's happening among the oligarchs as they're trying to move their cash? You know, trying to get to the meat and potatoes of those financial and economic sort of indicators. I think is probably the toughest, besides having to deal with my dog and children.
Okay, now I'm going to go backwards. Ian, is there a story that you about this war by you or your organization that you're most proud of?
I think that, you know, I think we're all going to feel this in some way. I think that we understand this to be an inflection point in history, potentially a big one. You know, I think feeling that you have the entire organization working flat out to write the best stories, tell it in both in a detailed, accurate way, and also sort of with a historic understanding and a context. I think that we've done that through a number of different stories, and frankly, you know, I know I'm supposed to, you know, sell the journal, but I think that, you know, my colleagues from other papers and organizations feel the same way, and I've seen a lot of good work from them too. So,
Patty, is there a story by you or your organization that you're especially proud of?
Well, I'll just talk about my own experience, because, you know, there's been hundreds and hundreds of stories by journalists all over. A lot of them are, you know, really in the thick of the fighting and such. But I did have the opportunity to go to the border. I went to Romania, and then we were able to cross over the border into Ukraine. And for me, that was just the kind of reporting that I like to do the best, which is on the ground reporting. So, you know, so much, particularly even during the pandemic, was kind of from a phone, from your dining room table, and talking to experts, which I think, you know, in the financial economic beat, maybe you do more so than a lot of other beats. And, you know, just the opportunity to get out and really kind of be on the ground there and talking. I did a bunch of stories about refugees coming in and the economic problems that they're facing and whether they'll stay and such. And that, those for me were the best stories.
And Howard, how about you?
So, you know, Fed Reporter, Washington based, we are, you know, far from those sorts of on the border, in the fray sorts of coverage. So I would not want to detract from, as Ian said, the folks that are out there in the middle of it. I think our team over there has been really very much on their money in terms of the impact on energy markets. And you know, the sort of unraveling of all of that. They've been pretty ahead of the game on that whole aspect of the story, I think.
Okay, well, as business reporters, we're told that the best way to find a story is to follow the money. So how do we follow the money for an event like a war in Ukraine? And how do you prepare a newsroom for covering a conflict like this through the financial and business lens? I'm asking you, Howard.
Oh, I'm sorry. Like it was well, like Ian said. So you got two challenges. One is that you know, we're not going to see the macro stuff except during the delay. So that being said, you know, you do see impacts on interest rates and things like that. That's sort of been very key to my world, understanding that you've got classic safe haven behavior. This is I think completely upended, at least temporarily, a lot of the expectations about what was going to happen to the 10-year Treasury, for example, things like that, which is really, I think, throwing the Fed, quite a curveball, which they're still adapting to. So, to me, I'm not down in the micro world of the particular bank that's going to be subject to a run, or the particular company that's going to find out, its foreign funding is gone, or they can't sell its bonds anymore. On the macro aggregates, you see this, and you see it reflected in the U.S. yield curve and things like that, and it's posing a problem for the Fed. That's kind of what I look at. Looking at the 10-2 right now, it's narrowed an awful lot since this happened, and that's affecting monetary policy.
I'd like to introduce our late addition here, Stephanie Baker, who is a senior writer at Bloomberg and Bloomberg Business Week, covering the intersection of business and politics. Hi, Stephanie, how are you?
Hi, sorry to be late. I didn't find the link.
That's okay. Well, I'll ask you the same question. What do you find the hardest thing about covering this conflict? And in the fog of war, where do you go for reliable information?
Well, yeah, so I have connections both to Russia and Ukraine. I lived in Russia in the 1990s, and I've interviewed a bunch of these Russian oligarchs that are in the line of fire right now. And I also traveled to Ukraine probably half a dozen times between 2017 and 2019 to write about Paul Manafort and Rudy Giuliani and all of their shenanigans in Ukraine. Worked with our reporters on the ground in Ukraine, great reporters who can do everything from politics to Rudy Giuliani to bond and wheat, coverage. So, I really admire the work that they're doing under incredibly difficult circumstances. They are business reporters. They are not trained to cover wars. So they've been put in a really difficult situation. Obviously I've got lists of people that I trust on Twitter that I'm following for, reliable information. And the focus of my reporting has been largely on sanctions, since that has been, I would say, the principal tool by the West to try to discourage Putin from waging war in Ukraine, because they don't want to engage in a conventional fight with a nuclear power. So I've been looking at sanctions. Now Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world, and just trying to look at where are the sanctions hitting hardest? Do they make sense? Are they going to work in the end? And I've done some reporting on that so far.
Well, that brings me to Ian wrote a piece called How the US and EU Cut Russia Off from the Global Economy. So one, how difficult was it to report that story? And since the sanctions haven't stopped Russia, have they been effective in other ways? And I guess I would pose that to you as well, Stephanie. But first, Ian, what do you think?
So in terms of difficulty of reporting out that story, I think you had a lot of players. I mean, you had some key players for sure, but you had, in terms of orchestrating a sanctions regime across the economy that was both precise and targeted, as well as enormous in the scope of financing that they caught. You had a lot of players, and so figuring out who to focus on, who were the real movers and shakers, who unlocked certain gears to allow this sort of policy to turn. I think that was the first hurdle. Then getting in touch with these folks. I mean, one of the folks that I spoke to gave up coffee in the new year, and they said it was a bad time to do it. They stuck to their commitment, and at one point that person and another person said, what day is it? Is this the third week? Is this the second week? And I think we as journalists who've been covering it understand that, because it's been an all-out flood. So trying to get a hold of these people and to get them to remember something that happened in a highly intense, nonstop process over several weeks has been a little bit difficult. And it requires insight from a number of different capitals, shall we say, to be able to ferret out sort of the key pieces of information. In terms of, whether the sanctions are working or not, I think that is the question is what does work mean? The top line goal, I guess, would be to get Putin to pull out forces and stop all extraterritorial aggression. That hasn't clearly happened. It could, it's cutting off funds, creating political pressure in the Kremlin, on the ground. Does it change any sort of calculus? Has he chosen to use some weapons but not others? Has he chosen some sort of targets and not others? Well, there's a lot of counterfactuals that we haven't seen and we don't know about. And so there may be some work involved. And I could go on, but I'm sure my colleagues have some great insights.
Okay, well, Stephanie, do you think the sanctions are having an effect in some way? And they're obviously adding to inflation in the US and threatening a huge increase in world hunger. So, is this helping the situation? Is it hurting the situation? Or are we just creating problems for everybody? I think you're on mute.
Sorry, the problem with sanctions is that they take a long time to have any real effect. Obviously, there's been the Russian economy has taken a huge hit by the measures introduced so far, and the most devastating steps have been the freezing of the Russian central bank reserves and kicking some banks out of SWIFT. But obviously, they've allowed much of Russian oil and gas exports to continue. I know there have been some restrictions, and Europe has tried to lay out a plan to reduce its dependence on Russian gas. I've been looking at, sanctioning the oligarchs because that has been so high profile, and you've had these seizures of yachts and jets and mansions being occupied, and really interested to see what is the effect of that. I think there's been this assumption that you sanction the oligarchs and they in turn turn around and put pressure on the Kremlin to stop waging war. And I think that is a pretty simplistic analysis of present day Russia, and is misguided in the way the role of the billionaires play right now in Russia. That used to be the case in the 1990s, where the oligarchs did have some sway over the Kremlin, and when Putin came to power in 2000, he chipped away at that and turned that whole system on its head. And instead of the oligarchs controlling the Kremlin, it's the Kremlin controlling the oligarchs, essentially. And I interviewed one sanctioned oligarch in London, Mikhail Friedman. I wanted to find out what happens when you're a billionaire and you're suddenly hit with these sanctions he was sanctioned by the UK. And
you've co-opted my question. I was going to ask you about him.
Ask a question on that.
Okay. So you wrote about Russian oligarch Mikhail Friedman, who told you that if the West is waiting for oligarchs to pressure Putin, they have no idea how Russia works. So one, how did you manage to convince Friedman to go on the record? And what was that negotiation like? And two, is there anything the oligarchs can do?
Yeah, he did not want to talk to me at first. He hung up on me basically the first time. I tried him back and he was very, very reluctant. And finally agreed after some back and forth. He spoke to me quite a bit off the record, where I can't really share what he said. Probably the most interesting things he said to me on background. I think obviously it's self-serving for him to say sanctioning me is not going to work, and that's pretty obvious. He had not prepared for the sanctions. He had not prepped himself by parking cash in places where he could get to it. So he was a billionaire, basically cut off from all sources of cash very quickly. And I think some of the things he said to me made me wonder, are these sanctions going to backfire? because, one, I think they're supposed to be designed to encourage capital flight from Russia, right? That will put further pressure on the ruble and on Russia. But some of the measures that are not even sanctions is Visa and MasterCard cutting off all ties. That means Russians who are fleeing the country in droves, hundreds of thousands of Russians have already fled, are having a hard time getting their money out. And his complaint to me is that, he has to apply to the UK Sanctions Authority for a license to spend money. And that request must be quote unquote reasonable. And apparently he was told reasonable was £2,500. And he's like, well, they just want me to go back to Russia. And I think the concern is some of these sanctions will just push some of these oligarchs back to Russia, which is what Putin has been wanting for years. He doesn't want all, Russia's top billionaires to be abroad spending money. He wants them home where he can control them. So I think there is a real question on whether or not the sanctions could perversely strengthen Putin's hand.
Well, let me ask you a little shop talk. How did you manage to convince him to go on the record?
You know what? I showed him the quotes before I was going to use, and I thought he would. I mean, he told me things he definitely was not going to go on the record with. There was only one quote he changed, which I was kind of surprised about, and it was very minor tweak. I think he was backed into a corner and probably thought, it couldn't get any worse, if that makes any sense.
Sure.
I have a question, Stephanie. Did you know him beforehand, or did you call him cold?
I had interviewed him once, one-on-one once before, during the whole saga over whether or not the Alpha Bank server was communicating with the Trump campaign, which turns out to, be largely dismissed as false. And then I had attended a dinner with him and a bunch of other people, other reporters, other journalists on Background, again, a couple years ago, pre-pandemic. So I didn't know him very well. And when I interviewed him in, I think that was 2017, and I wrote a story off of that, he was not happy with my story. He kind of flipped and complained. So I didn't think he was gonna, I thought I was not walking into what I thought was a welcoming situation by asking him for an interview, because he wasn't happy with what I'd written before.
Larry, can I come back to this idea? If you want to, if you have a different direction, I'd be happy to shut up. But can I come back to this question about whether they work or not?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's the thinking of that question is often a binary sort of question, yes or no, do they work or not? And I just want to reiterate that they're a much more complex tool. And so answering that question has to be nuanced. The 2014 regime did inhibit their ability to produce oil. They didn't have the technology for high pressure, high temperature drilling, offshore drilling in terrible conditions. They need Western technology, and that decreased their replacement rate for the reserves, which decreased their growth rate and the money the Kremlin had. Well, as we've reported, the Russian technology for communications has not been that great, and has been a key factor in the death of the top generals and officers. That is a technology repression sort of consequence. Longer term, there is the defunding of Kremlin power. There is the defunding of the all of the workings of the KGB. It's a smaller amount. Then you also increase the political pressure. And I totally agree with Stephanie in terms of, how the Kremlin works and, who uses who. I mean, I think we've seen who uses who. Putin does use them. He rewards the ones who do well and he punishes the ones that don't, and then he'll replace them. But that doesn't mean that there's not collective political pressure that is building. I mean, I think that you will have all of the potential previous allies of Putin in the oligarch world more aligning with the folks who are sitting in jail or being targeted for fraud by the Russian government. And then, I think there's also the question about what message it sends to the world as China's flexing its muscles in a sort of global hegemon way. This sends an unmistakable signal to Beijing that, hey, you may own $1 trillion worth of debt, but we hold those strings, that we're the sovereign owner of that debt and we can control it. It goes to the heart of the central bank and the ability to manipulate the economy through their own sovereign law. I think that sends a clear message to Beijing. So does that work?
Oh, I don't know. I'm asking you guys. But,
yeah, well, it's a question it's one that I'm not saying I have all the answers to. I'm just saying, these are the questions that need to be thought about in those terms when you talk about the geopolitics of financial warfare.
I'm going to take it in a different direction now. I'm going to ask Patty. You've actually been reporting in Ukraine and Romania, right?
Yes.
So how hard is it?
I want to emphasize, though, I was on the border of Ukraine. It was completely safe where I was. So, it's very different than a lot of my colleagues, the situation they're under.
Well, I mean, was it difficult for you to file from there? And do you know how difficult it is for your colleagues who are actually in, near the battles, how hard it is to file from there?
Again, and it was not difficult for me to file from there because, I was able to go back and forth in a day, and, we were staying at a hotel near the border that actually was also doubling as a refugee shelter as well, but it had Wi-Fi and technology was working. I honestly am not sure about, in the really bad sections, we've had reporters obviously in some of the worst hit spots and how they're managing. There actually was, I think the Associated Press, though, had a very harrowing account by their journalists and having to be kind of snuck out of, I think it was Kyiv before, because the Russians were looking for them, looking to target them. So some of the conditions actually seem very harrowing.
Okay. Well, you did a very interesting story about how some women are using Tinder as a communication lifeline with people in this refugee crisis. Can you tell us more about that story? And can you tell us more about the refugee situation on the ground?
So, this is one of the things that when I said before, like, I love to be reporting in the field because that was never a story I had anticipated getting. Fortunately, we have this live briefing, which is very popular, but also I kind of refer to it as the beast. You got to feed the beast because it's always hungry for more briefing items and such, which in a way, though, can be good because, as we all know, oftentimes, you've got 95% of the stuff in your notebook you can't even use, particularly if you've got lots of good anecdotes and such. And so that was just, I was hearing so many different stories from people who are coming over and explaining, how they managed to get out and what their plans were and how they were going to plan to pay for things and who they were going to meet and such. And so it's just, there were a million things that had come up that I would never even have thought to ask, even if I had been in a position to, call refugees and ask them. So, for instance, so this one woman who came over, she was a young woman, in her 20s, came over with a friend of hers and her friend, and they didn't know where they were going to stay, which is a situation, obviously, of a lot of people coming over. They're kind of escaping from a dangerous situation. And her friend had been on Tinder and she's like, well, I've had good experiences with it. Let me see what happens. And she put out a note and she got back this response, and from a lot of which, of course, I would be incredibly suspicious of, but ended up friends of friends, and actually they set them up to stay in a monastery there for the first week that they were in Romania, kind of like a friend of a friend of a guy who was in Bucharest. I did another short thing, just about the people who brought their pets. It was incredible. So many pets coming over. And one of the reasons this shelter was very popular in the hotel where we were was that the owner loved pets and you could bring them there, and a lot of other places you couldn't. And I didn't know this, but he had a vet come like on a Saturday night to issue, which you need, which are kind of pet passports if you want to go from country to country, and also a little ID chip that identifies, like a GPS that they have to insert under the pet's skin. That's one of the things that I just think is so interesting about reporting, and why I just think there's nothing that replaces kind of being there. And obviously so many of the stories, and I've done probably not nearly as many as these guys, but the sanctions story, the global economy stories, those are important. We need to do them and such, but it's satisfying in a different way to kind of be on the ground, and just there's much more of a feeling of discovery, I guess.
If she was finding any love, in the
Before
refugee process?
she had previously found love, which was why loves, I should say, but which was why she trusted it to look for a place to stay.
Okay, well, thanks. Howard.
Yep.
Cover the Fed. So how is the war hampering the Fed's moves to control inflation in the US? And you wrote a story on March 11th that said global central banks remain focused on inflation despite the war. So how fast is inflation growing in Europe? And will it affect the Fed? And how is the Fed balancing the threats of the economy versus what's happening with the sanctions?
Sure. Well, I think what you've seen, particularly in the last week, last 2 to 3 weeks, is the sense that whatever sort of risk of bad outcome from their policy existed, the weight on that side of the curve has gone up a lot, and they've clearly started to discount growth in the out years a little bit more. They've started to take a much, I think, more realistic view about the persistence of inflation in the U.S. and obviously jacked up their sense of what they're going to have to do. Prior to February 22nd, probably 60-40 a split in terms of folks with 40% in the minority who thought they were going to get out of this without having to actually put the brakes on the economy. I think that shifted to probably 3-1, 4-1, maybe even near unanimous feeling now that they're going to have to actually slow things down, which of course increases the recession risk. The European impact on growth is a lot more, potentially more direct. So you saw a little bit of a more cautious stance from the European Central Bank. The thing that is really tough to come to grips with right now is balancing how much this echoes the 1970s with the sense that it's not going to be in the end just like the 1970s. So we see some things developing, conflict-driven oil shocks, but yet an awful lot of growth in the U.S., an awful lot of pent-up demand, and an awful strong sort of household financial position that makes you think this is not going to end up in an imminent recession. But a lot of similar forces kind of coming together. So yeah, Fed's going to have to go faster. Their hope is that the U.S. economy has enough sort of a resilience and momentum built up within it so that they avoid the bad growth outcome.
What kind of financial data is publicly available to dig into these stories?
Well, so that listen, we get you got everything from short, high frequency to lower frequency stuff to augment this. Get a lot of reporting from the New York Fed, particularly on household balance sheets. So that lets you sort of keep track of whether people are, households are facing any kind of developing financial stress. That all appears to be good. You've got the classic stuff on, credit default swaps, different indicators of financial and liquidity stress. That all appears to be holding up. You know, through all the difficulties in the fog of war, you could make the case that, you know, things haven't been as bad as it, you know, certainly some inflation is building through the pipeline now. Price of oil is not going to, well, the folks over there, was it the deputy minister or something in Russia said that he thought it was going to be $300 a barrel. That doesn't appear like that's going to happen. So yeah, there's plenty of data floating around out there, short, you know, high frequency and more standard data series.
Ian, what about you? What kind of financial data is publicly available for what you're writing about? And if you could access any kind of private financial data to better cover your stories, what would be that holy grail? What would you be looking for?
Well, I don't want to give away all my secrets. So
Can you just send them to me later?
So I would say that there are a lot of data reports that if you piece together, you can get some idea of how to read what's going on. I think Howard talked about oil. There's a lot of data out there on, I mean, down to a granular level, the amount of tankers, storage, capacity online, capacity offline. You know, I'm curious, you know, what the difference between demand and storage, you know, production capacity that's offline. That could come online. You know, that would be a good indicator to look at. You know, where inflation might go. You know, there are the providers, that the institutions that are involved in the transactions between the U.S., Europe, and Russia. They have a pretty good eye as to what's going on. They are probably collating what they're seeing, and they have there are ways that data can come out. You know, where to find that. The most difficult, I think, is going to be in Russia itself, because of you know, well, there's less media allowed in, or at least the media that have some semblance of being able to tell the truth. There is, you know, the message is clearly controlled. So one wonders what sort of messages. Love to see the emails from Putin to the central bank governor about what she's supposed to say and what she's not supposed to say. You know, you know, and then anecdotally, you know, we might get anecdotes in Moscow or St. Petersburg from, you know, certain people, but then there are a lot of other people that we're not going to know exactly how hard it's hitting them. You know, how many pensioners are out there who are going to have to choose between, you know, milk or bread now. You know, so I think forming an accurate picture, both on the ground and at the 30,000 foot level, is difficult, but still possible.
Okay, I have a couple more questions, but if anybody in the audience wants to ask a question, you can use the chat function and we will ask one or two of these if we have time at the end. But, and here I'm going to throw this one out to the entire panel. Are the sanctions creating an economic depression in Russia? Is a Russian debt default inevitable? And is it a consequential event for financial markets in America? Or is it more of a kind of thing that it's a weighty geopolitical event, but without posing a serious risk of financial contagion? And if any of you know anything about that, I'm happy to listen.
I don't have the numbers.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Howard. No, go ahead, Howard. You're the
Sure thing. I don't have the numbers. I haven't looked up the BIS tables on this cross-border exposures lately, so I don't have them on the top of my head. But my sense from reporting and the folks I've talked to, as someone said to me, Russia is not Bear Stearns. They can default, and sure, there may be Credit Suisse or something like that has a pretty big hand in. Oddly, BlackRock and some of the others have been repositioning out as a result of this, but it doesn't seem like the numbers are large enough to make anybody kind of tilt over that's systemically important. And I think that's one of the, we've talked about perverse outcomes here. One of the, there's the old saw, if you owe the bank $1,000, they own you. If you owe them $10 million, you own them. Well, the fact that Putin spent so much time sort of cutting these ties and trying to find independence actually made him perhaps more vulnerable, because nobody's going to care if they default, really. I don't sense that the IMF and the World Bank are sort of sitting up thinking this is going to topple everything over.
But I mean, it's creating a depression in Russia. I mean, their whole economy is, people can't go to work, people aren't getting any money in. It seems like, a very volatile situation there.
Yeah, I mean, I just to chime in on that, I think you're right. It is having a huge impact, and on people who really are not the main target. They're not. It's not the leadership that's suffering from sanctions. It's not the billionaires. They'll be fine. It is, the sanctions are, decimating the Russian middle class, which most people think you need a healthy middle class to build any sort of semblance of a democracy. And some of the things that I've been trying to figure out, there was a Russian economist who estimated that 200,000 Russians fled in the first 10 days of the invasion. I'm sure that number is even higher now, and I think it's hard to quantify. A lot of those people are in former Soviet republics, and are on visas that will expire. They'll be forced to go back somewhere, and they're going to be looking for a place to go. The Russian tech sector also, massive brain drain. I covered the Russian central bank as a young reporter in Russia in the 90s, right before they defaulted. And it does feel very, very similar. It does look like a Russian default, if things continue as they are, is inevitable at some point. And I think Howard's right. I think that it's not like it was in 1998. But I do wonder if there's some version of long-term capital management, the hedge fund, that is exposed and we don't know it yet. And there could be some sort of blow up, because I think a lot of people didn't trust the intelligence that Biden was, so unusually publicly, describing about the buildup. And I as well thought, Putin wouldn't be so crazy as to try to invade a country of 44 million people and try to hold it. So I thought he'd bite off a chunk of, bite off Donetsk and Lugansk. And I think a lot of other people were caught unprepared and may not have been able to get out of the positions that they were in.
So do you think it'll have an effect on global markets, either bond markets or stock markets, that could cause a major run for the money or something like that?
I think it's hard to tell. It doesn't look like it, but I don't think we can rule it out.
No, rule it. But so real quick, Stevie, don't you think that? And look, there's no reason to think that someone like Vladimir Putin would see around this corner. But one of the things we wrote early on, and I think it holds up, is that the world kind of insured itself, or the U.S. did anyway, insured itself against this crisis by overdoing it the last time. I mean, maybe some of the late fiscal stimulus was too much, but in fact, it's sort of setting the stage to weather this and weather a little more Fed rate increase, for example, without the problems that might have developed otherwise. And I'd argue that Dodd-Frank and the capitalization status of U.S. banks has set them up well to absorb a long-term capital. If there is a hedge fund that has tentacles out there into the banking system, there's a lot more room to absorb a hit like that this time without a problem.
Yes, absolutely.
So the last crisis, I think, put us in a better position for this one. Yeah.
So on the, I don't think it's right to just look at the debt default. Their short-term funding needs are pretty low, and they're still getting a benefit from the rise in oil prices that is offsetting some of the loss of income elsewhere. I think, you know, the default is symptomatic of the bigger economic problem. As the 11th or 12th, depending on which table you look at, largest economy in the world, it's not insignificant. The situation has not escalated to the full level that it could, and the risk of some of Russia's major exports, including oil, natural gas, and aluminum, and other metals, could reverberate, add to the inflation. And you remember, oil is oil doesn't just, we're not just talking about the gas at the pump. We're talking about everything that is shipped across the seas and in trucks. We're talking about it feeds into everything. And if the war were to dramatically escalate, one of the things that really concerned me was the chemical and biological warfare lab information that misinformation that Putin was spreading, because it potentially, for me, was the same gameplay about creating the excuse to do something worse, and then being able to blame the West on it. And Putin is not going to give up. He is increasingly backed into a corner. There's a reason why he's shelling civilian targets. And so the real threat to the global economy, the US economy, the European economy is where this goes. And I just want to reiterate what Stephanie said about the people that feel the effects of this kind of sanction regimes, are the poorest, unfortunately, really unfortunately. And it's sickening, really, frankly, to think about the effects. If you think about Venezuela, it's a very visible effects. Yeah, but I think the sanctions regime, especially with European involvement, shows the extent to which European leadership believes this to be an existential threat.
And we have a question here that all the malls and stores in Russia or in Siberia have been closed since US corporations pulled out. And the war is also, as you're saying, harming the working class and not just the middle class. Do we have any idea how bad the suffering is going to get, or even around the world, people are going to be starving?
Are you talking about, you mean in Russia?
I was asking about Russia in particular, yeah.
I just to knit that point and the point that Ian was making before, and this is part of the political issue of sanctions, and when we talk about success or not, one of the things that sanctions do, and they do impact mostly the population, but when you have a leadership that doesn't really care about the population, and I think that is essentially the situation in Russia, where Putin himself, however many billions he has stashed away or something, it's not as if he is that going to be that responsive to public outcry. And so that's one mechanism, or one, let's say, pathway through which sanctions sometimes can work, which I don't think is the case. And then there's that, the problem is, as Stephanie pointed out before, where the focus then is on the oligarchs, but is that actually going to backfire?
Okay, here's another question from the audience. Any thoughts on the market or policymaker response to Western corporations, other than those with humanitarian motivation, that choose to remain engaged in Russia? what are people, I guess, how are they reacting to corporations staying in Russia?
I mean, we were just talking about, there have been some corporations that have stayed that are arguing the case, which is if they pull out, their workers will then have no money, no means of support. And so obviously, there's mixed motivations here. But the question is, their response or their defense is that we are doing this for our workers.
Yeah. So I would ask this question. Actually, just one more point on the last one. Russia is a huge grain exporter, which is critical for bread, and there are a number of countries, including former Soviet Union states, that heavily depend on that grain. And so, yes,
Ukraine is considered the breadbasket of Europe. So
yes.
Together, I think they're about 25% of all the wheat in the world.
Yeah, so there is a high risk of political instability elsewhere, besides the horror of starvation. But to answer the current question, what are corporations, right? Their primary objective is for profit, right? And as much as one can decide to build and found a company that has moral sort of objectives, especially publicly traded companies, or any company that has investors, they want a return. So the question will be, does it make business sense to do this? Is the net gain long-term worth it? Is the net, or not? And
yeah, so
yeah, go ahead, Stephanie.
I think about that a lot, because when I lived in Russia in the 90s, it was you were so excited when you had a Western company come in and make your life a little bit nicer, because it was still a bit of a rough place to live. And you've seen this whole Putin's statement about the possibility of seizing the assets of foreign companies that are leaving Russia. And so that is the state seizing those assets. And that, again, will essentially strengthen Putin's hand. Already since 2014, Russia is in a better position to withstand isolation from the global economy. They increased domestic food production, and domestic brands grew in a way that I think shielded them from sanctions. But now that so many Western companies have gotten out and Putin is talking about seizing those assets, you even have some of the oligarchs, Vladimir Potanin, Russia's richest man, came out criticizing that because of the threat that poses to property rights, right? This is, once again, feels a little bit like 1917 and the Russian state seizing private property. So I do think that there are these perverse effects of both the sanctions as well as the Western companies pulling out of Russia. That is the basis. All those Russians working for Western companies, and I know a lot of them, they were the force for good in the Russian political sphere. And to have them unemployed or fleeing Russia, trying to get out, leaves Russia bereft of a potential, opposition class.
Can I just play a devil's advocate to that idea? I mean, if you look at what happened to Venezuela, where the state seizure of most of the Western assets, I mean, you saw oil production fall from over 2 million, close to 3 million barrels a day to under 1 million because of their inability to operate these assets needed with Western technical capacity. And there's a reason why Russia invited all these Western companies in, and they still need it. Secondly, there is the so it's it is a long-term harm to Russia itself. The law does not change. So Putin can write what he wants to in terms of the law, the legal right to seize those assets, and yet if Russia ever wants to rejoin the global economy, it'll have to abide by international arbitration strictures. And there's a high likelihood that he, like Chavez and Maduro, will lose those arguments in the courts.
I'm sorry, I have two more questions, and as we're getting near the end here. So the first one is, does anyone think the Koch brothers are staying in Russia to look after all their workers there when they are hardly famous for looking after American workers?
I do not believe that.
Okay, nobody else
Howard,
wants
you
to
used
take
to
that one?
cover energy. You know the Koch brothers. You should answer this.
And my final question is mostly because Ian wrote a story about cryptocurrencies, and they're a big deal in Russia. And I know a lot of people have been talking about how they may get around the sanctions and get around some of the financial, the financial restrictions by using cryptocurrencies. And what a part are cryptocurrencies playing as Russia's avenues as for financing get squeezed?
Well, I'm going to give you the most honest answer right now. We don't know, but I think we can look at a number of factors and can guess what is possible. The crypto, you still have to off ramp it. You still need to turn it into dollars, euros, or Walmart credit cards. And that will provide a way to disrupt Russian movement of money, particularly because you're talking about large amounts. If you're really going to offset the sanctions, you're talking about tens of billions of dollars, right? And it's difficult for the market not to see it, especially in a blockchain sort of tech where it's the ledger allows you to track the movement of money. And I think, though, at the heart of the question is, so clearly it would be used. Secondly, at the heart of the question is, are there alternative financial systems that Russia could use, and will this foment or act as a catalyst for the development of non-Western financial systems? And I think there's a strong argument for both yes and no, for reasons that I'm not sure we have time to go into.
Okay, well, I would like to thank all of you for a very lively and informative discussion. And for anybody out there, if you're not yet a member of the New York Financial Writers, we would encourage you to consider joining.